today we're interviewing Dr. Ralph White, who is one of the pioneers of applying psychological insights to the field of conflict and war and conflict resolution. It's January the 9th, 2003. We're visiting Dr. White in Cockeysville. Where were you first in academia?
Wesleyan in Connecticut. My first 3 years of teaching psychology were there. Then I went to Stanford on a research project with Kurt Lewin, the Autocracy and Democracy book you've seen. They printed out, the chief printed output from the experiment that Ronald Lippitt started, and then from there I went directly to the government and actually worked for CIA for 3 years, but the innocent part of CIA, which consisted of radio broadcasts. Didn't have to kill anybody. Radio broadcasts from the Voice of America primarily.
Was that when
I was on the intelligence side of that, investigating Soviet public opinion primarily, but also simply the propaganda techniques used by the Soviet radio. Then I got into a conflict with Senator Dodd, who I delivered a paper on Soviet public opinion, which I had more or less focused on, and the paper supported the proposition that on matters of foreign policy, as distinguished from the way Stalin treated his own people domestically, on what he said about who the great danger in the world was, namely the United States, the people more or less went along with him. They went along with him more than they disagreed. Naturally, since they had no very good source of information other than the Voice of America, and although on an average evening I figured that we had some 2 or 3 million listeners in the Soviet Union, they still got most of their information from their own government, and if they have no specific reason to oppose it, they went along with their government. But I got in trouble with the senator, Senator Dodd, who became incensed at the idea of a picture of the Soviet Union. I better say what the date was. The date is very important. The date was long before our I don't know what to call it, the period when Gorbachev was in power.
Okay.
Long before Gorbachev, and all we knew very definitely about the Soviet Union was the behavior of the government, namely Stalin up till 1953, and Khrushchev from then on. In the process, became very much interested in the official relations between us and the Soviet Union, and most of all, the Cuban Missile Crisis. I believe that in Khrushchev's mind, that was very predominantly a defensive action on his part. This was the first time that a communist movement it happened to be under Castro, and it was the first time that there had been a successful revolution for as long as it lasted, and by now it's lasted quite a long time, which simply delighted the people at the top of the hierarchy in the Soviet Union. The first time of this thing that they'd been devoting their whole lives to worldwide communism, preferably worldwide. And here it was happening spontaneously, as it should, according to their lights. Well, this as I said, incensed Senator Dodd, the father, I believe, of the president, Christopher Dodd. I was not fired. He wanted me fired, according to Senator Dodd. I must be fired for stating something so outrageous as the proposition that most of the Soviet people shared their leaders' view of foreign policy. Not meaning revolution everywhere. The people weren't interested in revolution. They were concerned with the danger of American foreign policy to them, especially the nuclear danger. And that was the point I was making, but he wanted me fired. Ed Murrow was then in charge of USIA, the U.S. Information Agency, which I was working for. And he announced that White will not be fired. So I wasn't.
Was it sort of a but at the end of your sentence?
Yes. But after 3 more years, I decided that that the atmosphere in USIA was uncomfortable enough so that I would take the first good academic opportunity I had, and I did. 1964. I got a professorship at George Washington University in Washington, and I was very glad to stay in Washington. Good place to study political psychology. And since then, I've done most of the writing that I've ever done, because in an academic setting, I found it more conducive to writing. The 3 books that you have copies of. The first one came in 1960, summarizing the experiments on autocracy and democracy in small groups that Lewin and Lippitt had started and that I joined them in. I did nearly all of the writing of the book. Neither of them felt like writing, and were glad to have me do it. But from then on, my writing attention has been devoted to to the psychological causes of war, very broadly considered, and basing it mainly on not psychology but history. For my raw data came mostly from history and from 20th century history. I have concentrated on trying to understand as fully as possible the context of the 5 main conflicts America was involved in the 20th century: World War I, World War II, the Cold War, which was, only part of it was hot, but both the Korean War and the Vietnam War were hot, and they were very much part of what we have usually called the Cold War. And that brings us to where we are now. It's a book-length article that came just before I went to Vietnam.
Is that enough?
Well, actually, I started being interested in the causes of war when I was a junior in college.
Oh, okay.
And with the blessing of my professor, who taught me modern European history, I did a paper. It took me a full year to write. I was so much interested in it, and he postponed giving me a mark for the course until the paper was done, on German motives in 1914. And that fascinated me because I had been through it as a child. And I think the great majority of American citizens who were at all politically aware during the years of that war, I thought it was a black and white thing. That Germany was the aggressor, and France, and Belgium, and Britain, and then the United States had to stand up to the German aggressors. Well, what I discovered was that from their own point of view, the Germans were not the aggressors. It was primarily the English. And of course, directly, Russia and France helping Serbia, but thinking of England as the great conspirator behind those actors and also participating directly. Well, that was such a revelation to me. It turned upside down, not upside down exactly, but it gave me an entirely different perspective on the causes of war. As I see it now, I began to realize that misperception, seeing things wrong, was even more important as a cause of war than evil motives. The Germans, in their own eyes, were defending themselves and their allies in Austria against evil aggressors, and that I had to revise that when we came to World War II, because I realized that Hitler was not the Kaiser. They were very different personalities, and Hitler's war was Hitler's war, and it was a war of aggression. There were some resemblances. He really believed, I think, that the Jews were the great enemies of the human race, civilized human beings, and that they were conspiring to cause the governments of the rest of the world to oppress Germany. And he really believed that Germany was an oppressed country, but he jumped from that to think that it had to dominate at least all of Europe, if not also the United States. And that led to a much broader concept. I have since then thought of most wars as being mostly due to misperception, especially the demonized enemy image. But some wars as being essentially power hungry on the part of the government, often one individual, Hitler, for instance, or Stalin.
And one of the themes that comes through very clearly in Nobody Wanted War, the book that I was referring to, seems to be a continuing theme through much of your writing, and this is the idea of the need to understand an adversary. You use the word empathizing. I mean, I remember you writing something 10 years ago about empathizing with Saddam Hussein, and pointing out that how different empathizing is from excusing. But empathizing seems to be something that you thought of very early on and have sort of continued to use.
That has been unquestionably the concept in my writing that other people have latched onto with alacrity, including two that I am most pleased with. Two individuals have latched onto it in a big way. One of them was the first one was my memory. I'm getting old. And William Fulbright.
Oh, okay. Yes, Senator Fulbright.
Senator Fulbright. And the very recent one was Robert McNamara.
Really? McNamara?
Yes. Two people that are not generally put in the same category by most other people.
Generally not.
But McNamara has changed. He almost, in his very recent book entitled Wilson's Ghost, it's a discussion really of current affairs in the light of, or taken together with Wilson's ideas about war and its causes and the need for effective international organization to prevent it. And he, in this book, he has 2/3 of a page entirely devoted to quoting from my article on on empathizing with the leaders of I didn't use the word leaders, I used the word masters, I think, masters of the Soviet Union. And he, in his discussion of what I said, McNamara what was I going to say? I was going to say something.
Talking about empathizing with McNamara's use of that idea.
Yes. He was careful to define it, as I do. And that I think was probably true of Fulbright too. That I define it very simply as understanding the thoughts and feelings of others. Both the thoughts and the feelings need to be considered in relation to each other, and each one helps to explain the other. And in the case of the causes of war, it's necessary to distinguish between the psychology of the initial aggressors and the psychology of others who come in very often on the side of the victim of aggression, as the United States, first England, Britain, and then the United States a good deal later came in against the Kaiser's government, and also a good deal later than the very beginning in World War II against Hitler. Much too late. I don't mean it was too late to win the war, but the war could have been greatly shortened if the United States had come in sooner on either of those wars.
But Nobody Wanted War was mainly a book about Vietnam. How did
Oh,
you,
yes.
How did you
Only the first chapter was a very sketchy suggestion of how these same concepts applied to other wars, especially World Wars I and II.
But then, did you actually visit Vietnam?
Oh, yes.
To help you write the book?
I was there for 2 months in 1967, working for the American government, the Defense Department, actually, on Vietnamese peasant opinion.
And did you use a lot of that material in the book eventually? Because you wrote it very shortly afterwards, I think. Came out in 1968, I think, the book.
Yes, it came out as a book length, but short book length issue of the Journal of Social Issues, put out by not political psychology, but
Psychologists for Social Responsibility, if I remember rightly.
Yes. And that paperback article, long article, full length of all the entirety of the journal article, that came out in 66, actually. I did an intensive job during the first year of our being in the war, studying its causes. I thought by then I had enough general ideas about the psychological causes of war. And I read everything I could put my hands on to understand the Vietnam War, and I think I got a better idea of it, and it was because I don't suppose anybody else studied it that thoroughly, but this thing was read by the people I got acquainted with in Vietnam, starting in the summer of 1967.
What was their reaction?
And their reaction was, I think some of them were dismayed that I put as much blame on the United States as I did. This is probably a good place in this interview to say that I'm by no means a pacifist. I think we were right to get into World War I and should have gotten in sooner. I think we were right to get into World War II and should have gotten in sooner. We were very right to keep the Cold War from becoming hot, but in the process we demonized our image of post-Stalin Russia Khrushchev was nowhere near as villainous as Stalin was, and of course Gorbachev, when he came along, was the opposite.
It did take us a long time to realize that.
It took us a long time to realize that for most of the Soviet people, they wanted peace even more than we did, all the way through. And that was an important point to me. And it applied to also to the Vietnamese and to the Koreans. I think the two wars that we were wrong to fight, mistaken, of the five, were the Vietnam War and the Korean War. And since then I have gone more thoroughly into the Korean War so as to cover, to some extent, all five of the major conflicts that the United States has engaged in the 20th century.
You said that you worked for a number of years with Kurt Lewin, who was a very much a figure of interest and a pioneering figure in our field. What sort of a person was he? What was it like working?
He was a very productive thinker, especially in using diagrammatic analogies to psychological processes. And it was but he I don't think was a rigorous thinker. And rigorous thinkers in mathematics and elsewhere thought he was wrong to try to dignify his rather loose psychological thinking with the prestige of mathematics by calling it topology. Because topology is a branch of mathematics with a deal of dignity, I suppose. And actually Lewin would grant immediately that he didn't use any of the theorems or the hypotheses of topology applied to psychology, but he did use a pictorial approach that resembled topology. And that's what he meant by the word. He wasn't trying to borrow prestige from anybody, according to him. Now, maybe unconsciously he was.
People used to get very indignant about Kenneth Boulding, who was another person who did a great deal of diagrammatic work in some of his earlier writings. But Boulding always had the defence that he actually was an economist and as well a mathematical economist. So he could defend himself by saying that he knew what his diagrams meant and he knew what their limitations were. But Lewin was always known as, in my part of conflict analysis, conflict research, as a practical theorist. He always wanted to put his ideas into practice. And I guess that's why there's this fascination with him, because we know not very much about him. And yet some of his ideas have become very familiar as they sort of come down to us. So I was interested that you'd actually worked with him. And
he was fun to work with, ebullient, and fascinated by what he was doing.
And Lippitt, what was Lippitt like?
Lippitt was what?
What was the contrast between Lewin and Lippitt? I mean, you worked with both of them.
Well, I told you that Lippitt started the whole thing, the autocracy-democracy experiments, but he came not from psychology or any other respectable academic discipline, but from group work, and especially recreational groups,
Really?
like scout troops.
Uh-huh.
And he had been to college in Springfield, Illinois, or Springfield, Massachusetts, I don't remember which, where there were a good many men who worked with boys in Boy Scout troops or in other ways, and who, as he was studying there, before he went to Iowa, who would argue, one of their chief subjects of discussion was, how autocratic should you be as a scoutmaster or as a leader of any boys group, teenage boys groups. And he conceived the idea of trying to find out and trying to use careful experimental controls to keep constant the things he wanted to keep constant, and vary only the philosophy of the leader.
That's the difference.
And the working philosophy of the leader. Well, that made quite a stir in the late 30s among educators and among industrial people who applied it to the factory. I don't think that people have been paying attention to it much of any since perhaps, I don't know, 1941.
Well, you keep coming back in a lot of your writing, it seems to me, to, as you said, this whole idea of sort of misperceptions and mistakes in decision making, and how countries get involved in wars that they really don't intend to get involved in and they would rather avoid. This is a sort of an unfair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because we seem to be doing the same sort of thing at the moment.
I'm delighted to know that you're doing it.
Well, it does seem to me that if we need to learn anything from your books, it's something along the lines of not getting involved in the kind of process that we're getting in at the moment, because we are demonizing a lot of people. And I'm sure they have their views and attitudes that we ought to understand. Do you have any suggestions as to how we might begin to empathize with some of the other people that we're demonizing at the moment? I mean, do you think this is...
Saddam Hussein or...
Well, the rulers in Tehran, the rulers in Pyongyang. I mean, you must have thought about this.
Oh, yes. In a case like Saddam, or Hitler, I think it's important to talk a good deal about the power drive and what leads people to want power intensely. You can't fully separate motivation from cognition, but it's important to study their interrelationships. And for instance, I think Hitler really believed his accusations against the Jews. That was part of his psychopathology. And Stalin really believed his accusations against the capitalist war makers of the West. But that led to and was combined with some motivational differences, especially the overvaluing of power. Power, I think, was an obsession with Hitler and Stalin and Saddam. So that the word misperception is somewhat too mild to represent this combination of obsessive motives and perceptions of the world.
Yes, a lot of my students don't like the word misperception.
You know my 6 main forms of misperception in the beginning of the Vietnam War.
The sort of black top images.
I haven't changed it much, but I'd like to tell you the most recent change. I would now list 3 groups of 2. Demonizing and exaggerated fear belong together. And it's the exaggerated fear that directly causes war more than the demonized enemy image. There has to be a combination of belief that guy over there has it in for you, wants to kill you, and thinking he could, that he has the power to do it. And therefore you have to have power. And that becomes pretty basic if you harbor that thought through most of your life.
Or if you suddenly have it if you suddenly come to a realization or a perception that that's the situation, as I think many of us did after the September attack on the United States.
They're just as dangerous whether they are inherently afraid or inherently power-seeking. If the power-seeking leads to an obsessive desire, if the fear leads to an obsessive desire for power, those are the main variables, I think. Then come another pair consisting of military overconfidence and a glorifying of the self in general, the national self. That's the broader thing. In the first pair, demonizing and exaggerated fear, there too it depends on your image of the power of the enemy. We never got excited against Albania, for instance, though they may have been just as evil as the Russians. They were just as good communists. And now in this pair, I should have put self-glorification as the first one and the broader one, a main form of which, and the most war-producing form, is military overconfidence. And then two others that are not in themselves motivating to war: selective inattention and what was the sixth one? Oh, lack of empathy. And of all these six, it's the lack of empathy and my definition of it that has been picked up by the most people, including friends of mine, who usually find that the most interesting in what I write, and these two people that I'm most delighted to have latch on to the concept, McNamara and Fulbright. They both latched onto that and define it my way. I think they realize that in order to be clear, a choice has to be made between empathy, used loosely as almost a synonym for sympathy, which is very common, and empathy scrupulously confined to understanding of a particular sort.
But looking back, you've talked about sort of history as being a major influence on you, but whose ideas, whose theories, whose writings do you think have most influenced you?
It's funny, I never put the question that way. Well, the first people who, they were called revisionists in the 1920s, who wrote a revised interpretation of World War I. And they had a lot of influence on other historians. They really changed the main emphasis of historical writing.
So a set of historians.
And nobody on World War II who influenced me, especially because the main facts were well known and I don't disagree with them. I mean, I don't disagree with commonly accepted theories of World War I. World War II, I do disagree, and I wish more others in the West would have learned what I did in the 1920s about how misperception can cause war. Jack Levy is the political scientist who has written his work on misperception has been more important than any work on misperception that I know of by either. His work on the kinds of misperception that occur in human conflict is more important in that context than anything other people have done in either political science or psychology. There was a flurry of interdisciplinary thinking in the early 80s with Jack Levy's book on, not his book, his encyclopedic long article on misperception in international relations, misperception and international conflict. He criticized me, you may know, and I am glad he did, because I was being superficial. But he started, he wrote that at least several years after my first work on Vietnam, which came out in '66, and his was, I think, '82 probably. But then there was this guy at Cornell whose background was history and political science, as Jack Levy's was, and as Jervis was. It's the political scientists who have taken the lead and influenced the few psychologists who have cultivated the same field. And historians, of course, for all of them, as source of raw material, raw data, that we have taken and applied our own concepts to, and maybe modified the concepts on the basis of that. I don't know anyone who was primarily a historian who did that. Their contribution has been to provide the raw data and organize it in terms of particular wars, as it needed to be, of course. You need to, if you're going to understand the German Kaiser, you need to know a little bit about psychiatry and a lot about what Germany was like in those days, as a historian would. There have been particular relationships between particular theorists. Individuals, yes. As you can see, I've got most of my ideas that weren't original with me, I've gotten them mostly from political. Curiosity about misperception. Curiosity about the misperceptions of particular nations and particular leaders. That is what is most needed as a starting point. From there on, I think the knowledge of the practitioner, the diplomat himself, or like McNamara or Fulbright, or government people, I think for them and for the general public, the essential thing is curiosity about misperception. Because if they have that, what could have led a sane person to do this terrible thing? That sort of question. And that would lead, of course, directly to misperceptions about the diabolical enemy.
But with
why in the world would anybody dare to start a war in view of all the piled up evidence of how much harm it does compared with good? The military overconfidence is a main answer, and but the historians know about that. they
A short war illusion.
It's pretty obvious if a country overestimates its military power and takes undue risks for that reason. I think we're doing that very much now. We don't we haven't learned the lesson of Vietnam as to the likelihood of stubborn fighting by primitive groups, technologically primitive groups, guerrilla fighters. And the lessons we should have learned from both Vietnam and the history of communism in China. I think that the 6 concepts that I have put first and that I've mentioned just here, it's almost the same as what you find at the beginning of the Vietnam book. They should be in the back of the mind of any political scientist or historian dealing with the causes of war.